From the moment Jake slid into the seat next to mine at that party, it felt like we were on the same wavelength. I can still picture those deep brown eyes of his. Framed by a mop of curly brown hair, he never seemed to bother brushing. The messy look worked for him, though. It matched his laid-back vibe. He was tall, had a strong build, and his neatly trimmed beard accentuated his sharp, chiseled features. Jake had this way of making you notice him without even trying. Whenever he got distracted, texting, napping, or zoning out while watching highlights of his favorite basketball games on the couch, I tried to sneak behind him and comb his unruly hair. It was my little joke, but Jake hated it, so I only did it every once in a while. Looking back, I guess I did not know much about his past during the brief time we were together. He rarely opened up about it, and when he did, it was only near the end. Maybe it was my selfish curiosity, the hope of unraveling his mysteries, that kept me around. I could not quite put my finger on what drew me to him, but for a while it just worked. It was the summer of 1999 when Jake approached me at a friend's party. I remember he smelled incredible, like cedarwood and roses, unexpected and unforgettable. He complimented my dress, said I looked stunning, and had this quiet confidence that set him apart from the other guys I usually met at bars or parties. His eyes had this way of studying you, soft yet piercing. Before I knew it, I was caught up in his charm. We ended up spending the night together. Thinking back on it now, I am not sure what I was thinking, but that night marked the start of a whirlwind that changed my life. After a year of dating, we decided to move in together. Jake had an apartment in South Austin, and we made it our home for the next year. I quickly learned that he was not the most organized person. He would leave messes everywhere, always blaming it on his long hours at work. We had our share of arguments, like most young couples do, and Austin's high cost of living did not make things any easier. Rent was a struggle. Jake always seemed to scrape together just enough money at the very last minute. When it became clear I needed to chip in, I started hunting for part-time jobs. As a 19-year-old college student, I barely had any time, but I figured I could manage something small to help keep us afloat. Jake told me he worked for his father's construction company as a co-founder. He said they had several employees, but I started having doubts when his paychecks dwindled to just $600 to $750 a month. Barely enough to live on in 2003. He claimed the company was cutting back because of a boycott, but something about his story felt off. One day, while studying calculus on the couch, a wave of curiosity got the better of me. I decided to surprise Jake at work with a tray of fudge brownies. He had told me the company, Colleen's Construction, was named after his late mother. He said they were working on a site down Pierce Lane. I thought it would be a nice gesture, but deep down, I also wanted to see for myself what was going on. When I arrived, I found a muddy construction site roped off with engineer tape. A handful of workers stood around smoking and chatting. Nervously clutching the tray of brownies, I approached them and asked if Jake was on site. I mentioned that he was supposed to be a co-founder of the company, but my words were met with blank stares. "Wait," one of the workers finally said. "You mean Colleen Thatcher? The old lady who lives in that mansion in Westlake Hills?" I felt my face flush. Maybe," I stammered, suddenly unsure of everything. The man looked at me sympathetically and offered to check with his boss, but I was too embarrassed to continue the conversation. No, that is okay," I said quickly. "Maybe I have the wrong site." As I turned to leave, I remembered the brownies. "Hey, do you guys want some?" I asked. They exchanged glances, and then one of them grinned. "We would love some brownies right about now." I handed over the tray, and within seconds it was wiped clean. They thanked me warmly, and one even shouted, "We love you," as I walked back to my car, laughing softly at the unexpected moment of kindness. But as I sat in my car, staring at the empty tray, a sinking feeling settled in. Where was Jake? On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and flipped open my phone. His contact stared back at me. I hesitated, then hit call. After a few rings, he picked up, his voice sounding distracted and tired. "Hey, baby," I said, forcing a cheerful tone. "What time are you getting back tonight?" There was a pause before he answered, Not sure. We're working on this kitchen remodel, and it is turning into a bigger project than I expected. I will try to be home soon, but it might be late. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:05 p.m. I remembered the workers saying they clocked out by then. My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice steady. "Okay, see you tonight," I said, though my voice wavered just enough to betray my worry. "All right, love you," he said, hanging up quickly. His words echoed in my head as I kept driving. A minute later, my phone buzzed with another call from him. "You did not say I love you back," he said. I frowned, tilting my head in confusion. A moment of silence passed between us before David, with forced levity, sang out, 3-3 love you. I sighed heavily, puffing out my chest to muster the courage to respond. "David, I'm not playing this game with you." He gasped softly, as though genuinely taken aback, and his tone shifted to one of nervous hesitation. "Taylor?" I shot back quickly, my voice firm. "I don't know where you are or what you're doing, but I know you're not at that construction site. So where are you?" A tense silence stretched between us. I gave him the chance to answer, but when he finally spoke, his voice was stammering. I don't, Taylor." I cut him off sharply. "I'm giving you 20 minutes to come home." His voice rose, frantic and defensive. "Whoa, hold on." But I didn't let him finish. I ended the call, my thumb pressing the button with a finality that made my heart race. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to feel proud of standing my ground, but guilt crept in, muddying my resolve. What if he just needed space? Maybe I was overreacting. After all, I loved him. I didn't want to hurt him. But this wasn't the first time. The lies, the half-truths, the dodged questions. It was a pattern I could no longer ignore. Shaking off the pangs of regret, I gripped the steering wheel tightly and headed home, determined to confront him once and for all. The drive felt endless, though it was only 10 minutes. As I pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, I noticed his black Volkswagen wasn't there yet. I turned off the engine and sat in the stillness, waiting. The night air was heavy, and so were my thoughts. Who is he with right now? I shoved the thought aside, unwilling to let it consume me. A few minutes later, his car pulled into the lot. I watched as he shuffled around inside, reaching across the passenger seat. Whatever he was doing, it looked suspicious, like he was trying to hide something. I noted the absence of a neon vest or hard hat, just his black LA cap and a hoodie. My heart sank further. I got out of my car and approached him, my hands trembling at my sides. He stepped out of his car and met me halfway, his hands in his jacket pockets, a sarcastic half-smile on his face. "What's in the glove compartment?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. David stopped, his smile faltering as he pulled his hands out of his pockets and gestured exaggeratedly. "What? Seriously, Taylor?" I folded my arms, narrowing my eyes at him. We stood there in silence for a moment, the tension between us palpable. Then, without another word, I pushed past him and headed for the passenger side of his car. "Taylor, stop." His voice rose, tinged with panic. "I just want to talk to you." But I didn't stop. I opened the door, and the strong, unmistakable scent of weed hit me immediately. I knew David smoked occasionally, but this felt different. I scanned the passenger seat empty. My gaze shifted to the glove compartment. "Taylor, don't," he said softly, almost pleading, as I reached for the handle. I ignored him. Inside, I found the usual clutter: registration papers, his birth certificate, random receipts. But tucked in the back was a small, rolled-up sheet of paper. I pulled it out, unwrapping it to reveal a bag filled with crystalline granules. My breath caught. It wasn't disbelief at what I was seeing. It was disbelief in myself, in how I had let things get to this point. Gently, I placed the bag back and closed the glove compartment. My hand lingered on the car door as I stared at my reflection in the window. "Construction, huh?" I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and heartbreak. David didn't flinch. His face was serious, his hands still buried in his pockets. "We need the money, Taylor," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "We're late on rent. We can't even afford groceries right now." What else am I supposed to do? He stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. His voice softened. I fucking love you, you know that? I jerked my shoulder away, tears streaming down my face. Turning to him, I forced myself to speak through the lump in my throat. The lease is yours now, David. I don't want any more of your excuses. I turned and started walking toward our apartment. David's voice rose behind me, sharp and desperate. What the fuck do you think you're doing, T? I didn't answer, my steps quickening as sobs threatened to escape. All the lies, the betrayals, the half-truths, everything about him unraveled in my mind. I felt foolish for ever trusting him. Just as I reached the door, I felt his hand grip my shoulder. I spun around, my voice shaking but forceful. Don't fucking touch me. David let go of my shoulder as I opened the door. The disarray inside hit me like a wave, a stark reminder of the chaos we'd both let fester. Dirty dishes piled on counters, clothes strewn across the floor, and the faint smell of stale air hung in the room. My stomach churned. How had I ever been okay with this? David followed close behind, his footsteps heavy with purpose. I made my way to the bedroom and opened the closet, yanking out a suitcase. Without a word, I began emptying my dresser, throwing clothes into the open case in angry handfuls. What the fuck are you doing? David demanded, his voice low and tight. I ignored him and reached for another drawer. Suddenly, his hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with bruising force. David, I snapped, wrenching my arm. What the fuck are you doing? He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled me roughly across the room. I thrashed, screaming for him to let go, but his grip was unyielding. His strength far outweighed mine, and no amount of struggling could free me. I lashed out, my fist connecting with his mouth. Let me go, I screamed, desperation cracking my voice. The next moment, he lifted me effortlessly and threw me onto the bed. My breath left me in a sharp gasp as I landed, and I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for what came next. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable metallic click of a gun being cocked. Slowly, I opened my eyes. David stood at the foot of the bed, his arm extended, a handgun aimed directly at me. His face was eerily calm, devoid of emotion, yet his eyes were red and brimming with unshed tears. Please, I whimpered, throwing my hands up. Don't do this. Please, David, don't. Shut the fuck up, he barked, waving the gun in frustration. I bit back a sob, trembling violently. Who the fuck do you think paid for all this, huh? The bed, the food, everything. Me. His voice cracked as he gestured wildly around the room. And now you're leaving? After everything I've done for you? You ungrateful bitch. Tears streamed down his face, and he wiped them away with his sleeve, his hands still gripping the gun tightly. I fucking loved you, Taylor, he whispered hoarsely. David, I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady. I am sorry. Please put the gun down. We can talk this through. We'll figure it out together like we always do. His lip curled in a bitter grin. Lies. All fucking lies. You'll leave the second I turn my back. Don't pretend otherwise. I won't, I said, inching forward on the bed. Promise. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine for any hint of deceit. For a brief moment, I thought I'd reached him. Then his expression hardened again. Before he could say another word, a loud crash echoed from the living room. David spun around, gun raised, and fired wildly at the door. Glass shattered, and I ducked down, covering my head as bullets whizzed overhead. Police! Drop the weapon! A voice boomed from outside. David ignored the warning, retreating into the closet as gunfire erupted. I curled into a ball on the floor, screaming as shards of glass rained down around me. Put the gun down, another voice shouted. Peering through the chaos, I saw 3 officers closing in on the closet. David crouched inside, his eyes locking with mine. For a moment, his face softened. His lips moved, but I couldn't hear the words over the ringing in my ears. One officer inched closer, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. It's over, man. Just put it down. David glanced at me one last time, his face contorted with a mix of regret and rage. In a flash, he swung the gun toward the officer and fired. The room erupted in chaos as the officers returned fire. David's body slammed against the back of the closet, sliding to the floor. Blood seeped through his hoodie, pooling beneath him. "Suspect is down," an officer called out, his voice strained. Another officer rushed to the one who had been shot. "Are you hit?" "Just my vest," the wounded officer grunted, clutching his chest. I stayed frozen on the floor, unable to move or speak. One of the officers approached me cautiously, his hand extended. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked gently. I stared at his outstretched hand, my mind numb. Finally, I reached for it, letting him pull me to my feet. My legs wobbled beneath me, and he steadied me with a firm grip. As he led me toward the door, I glanced back at David. He was slumped in the closet, his breathing shallow, his face pale. His lips moved faintly, forming words I couldn't hear. "Don't touch her," he rasped, his voice barely audible. The officer guided me outside, his voice calm and steady. "Let's get you out of here." Behind us, David's labored breathing slowed, fading into silence. As we exited the building, Officer Ramirez released his hold on me. My legs wobbled, but I managed to stand on my own. The ringing in my ears persisted, muffling the world around me. Ramirez's voice came through like static, distorted and distant. "You've been through a lot, but we're going to take care of you," he said gently. "Medics are downstairs. He'll walk you to them." Paramedics rushed past us, their stretcher bouncing slightly as they ascended the stairs. Through the haze of my shock, I noticed neighbors peeking through blinds, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. One woman stepped outside, her face pale with concern. "Ma'am, please stay in your home," Ramirez called out to her. The woman glanced at me briefly before retreating inside. I followed her gaze and saw the bullet holes in the shared wall of our apartment. A pang of guilt hit me. It wasn't just my life that had been disrupted tonight. Ramirez placed a steady hand on my back, guiding me toward the waiting ambulance. A paramedic leaned out of the ambulance. "Hey, Ramirez, you hit?" Ramirez shook his head and waved dismissively. "Nah, I'm fine. She's the one who needs attention." The paramedic frowned. "Like hell you're fine. Get in here. Now." Ramirez smirked at me, a wry grin that somehow cut through the chaos. "This guy, huh?" he joked, helping me into the ambulance. He climbed in after me, shaking his head at the paramedic's insistence. The medics swarmed me, checking my vitals, shining lights into my eyes, and asking questions. Their chatter blended into the muffled background, a swirl of concern and clinical detachment. One medic reassured me, "You're going to be fine. We'll take you to the hospital to make sure everything checks out." When I hesitated, the medic added, "And don't worry, you're not paying for the ride." Another medic quipped, "This one's coming out of your paycheck." Ramirez. "Ah, fuck off," Ramirez muttered, rolling his eyes. Despite everything, I let out a strained chuckle. For the first time that night, I felt a sliver of normalcy, even if it was fleeting. When we arrived at the hospital, my parents were waiting at the emergency room entrance. The sight of them broke something in me, and I crumbled into their arms. "My baby girl," my dad sobbed, kissing my forehead. My mom clutched me tightly, whispering, "You're safe now. It's okay." The medics urged them aside and wheeled me into the hospital. Doctors peppered me with questions, performed quick checks, and guided me to a small room with a padded bed. My parents followed, their worry etched into every line on their faces. Inside, my dad sat stiffly, his fists clenched. My mom perched beside me, stroking my hair and murmuring soft reassurances. After what felt like hours, a nurse entered the room. She was petite, with blonde hair tied neatly into a bun, and she asked for a urine sample. I followed her to the bathroom across the hall, completed the request, and left the sample on a labeled shelf. When I returned, I paused outside the room. Through the frosted glass door, I saw my dad pacing, his hands gesturing wildly as he yelled, "That bastard better hope he's dead." My mom tried to calm him, placing her hands on his back. I lingered in the hall, catching movement out of the corner of my eye. Two tall men in black hoodies stood at the far end, partially obscured around the corner. Their eyes locked with mine. For a moment the world froze. Then, as if sensing my alarm, they turned and disappeared down the corridor. I shook my head, dismissing the encounter as a trick of my frayed nerves, and stepped back into the room. "Dad," I said softly, "please." He stopped mid-rant, his shoulders heaving with heavy breaths. Before he could respond, a doctor entered, followed by a security guard. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice," the doctor said firmly but respectfully. My dad straightened, swallowing hard. Yeah, okay. Sorry." The doctor nodded and left, but the tension in the room lingered. My dad sat down, gripping his jeans tightly, his fury simmering just beneath the surface. Minutes later, the nurse reappeared, her demeanor noticeably tense. She avoided my parents' gaze and asked to speak with me privately. I glanced at my dad, who gave a small nod of permission. Outside in the hallway, the nurse hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. She took a deep breath and handed me a small sheet of paper. "Ms. Welch," she began, her voice measured. "Your test results are still processing, but we have news from your urine sample." My heart pounded as I scanned the paper. 3 words leapt off the page, shaking me to my core. "Pregnancy test. Positive."